April 1945. Western Germany. A line of German prisoners moved slowly along a muddy road bordered by shattered trees and abandoned military vehicles. The war, that had consumed Europe for nearly 6 years, was collapsing around them. Smoke drifted across distant fields. Allied aircraft circled overhead without opposition. Somewhere beyond the horizon, entire German armies were surrendering. The men trudged forward carrying little more than blankets, canteens, and whatever remained of their strength. Then a different smell reached them. Coffee. Near an American processing station, large field kettles steamed beneath canvas shelters, while U.S. soldiers stood holding metal mugs. The aroma drifted through the damp spring air. Some of the prisoners exchanged amused looks. A few laughed. For years they had heard stories about Americans and their endless coffee drinking. Even now, with the war nearly won, the soldiers seemed unable to put their cups down. To many Germans, it looked almost ridiculous, yet before long, some of those same prisoners would be handed cups of their own. What followed was not simply a taste of an unfamiliar drink, it was an unexpected glimpse into the industrial power, culture, and confidence of the nation that had helped defeat the Third Reich. The story of that first cup began long before these prisoners reached the camp gates. By the spring of 1945, the war in Europe was entering its final chapter. Less than a year earlier, German soldiers had still been fighting on multiple fronts, stretching from France to the Soviet Union. Yet after the Allied landings in Normandy on June 6, 1944, the balance of power shifted with growing speed. American, British, Canadian, and other Allied forces pushed steadily eastward across France. Paris was liberated in August. By autumn, Allied armies stood at Germany's borders. The German military continued to resist, but the foundations supporting that resistance were beginning to crumble. Fuel shortages became severe. Factories struggled under constant bombing. Railway networks suffered repeated disruption. Replacement vehicles arrived more slowly. Ammunition became harder to transport. Even food supplies grew increasingly uncertain in many regions. The vast industrial machine that had fueled Germany's early victories could no longer keep pace with the demands of a global war. Ordinary German soldiers felt these changes every day. Many units spent long periods moving between defensive positions with limited supplies. Vehicles were abandoned when fuel ran out. Horses returned to roles that trucks had once performed. Rations became less predictable. Coffee itself had largely disappeared from military life. In its place came substitutes made from roasted grains, chicory, acorns, or other available ingredients. These drinks provided warmth, but they lacked the flavor and strength of real coffee. At the same time, German troops faced an enemy whose resources seemed almost endless. American artillery batteries rarely worried about ammunition shortages. Allied aircraft appeared in overwhelming numbers. Fresh vehicles, fuel, food, and equipment continued arriving across oceans thousands of miles away. To many German soldiers, the contrast became impossible to ignore. The final German offensive in the West, the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, briefly slowed the Allied advance. But when the attack failed, Germany lost precious reserves it could never replace. From that point forward, the Allies resumed their march toward the Rhine, while Soviet forces advanced relentlessly from the east. The war was no longer a question of who would win. The question was how long Germany could continue fighting. As winter turned into spring, surrender became a reality for growing numbers of German troops. Entire formations laid down their weapons. Columns of prisoners filled roads, leading toward temporary collection point and processing centers established by Allied forces. Many of these men expected captivity to be difficult. Years of wartime propaganda had shaped their assumptions about what awaited them beyond the front lines. Yet before they could discover the reality of imprisonment, they encountered something else, something so ordinary to Americans that it barely seemed worth noting. A steaming cup of coffee waiting beside a field kitchen would soon reveal far more about the war than many battlefield reports ever could. To understand why a cup of coffee could leave such an impression on German prisoners in 1945, it is necessary to look beyond the battlefield and into the immense logistical system that stood behind every American soldier. The United States entered the war with advantages few nations could match. Its factories were largely untouched by enemy attack. Its railroads stretched across an entire continent. Its farms produced enormous quantities of food. Most importantly, the American economy possessed a capacity to manufacture and transport supplies on a scale that astonished both allies and enemies alike. By 1945, that system was operating around the clock. Ships crossed the Atlantic carrying fuel, ammunition, vehicles, spare parts, medical supplies, clothing, and food. Cargo unloaded at ports in Britain and France moved through warehouses, rail lines, truck convoys, and supply depots before finally reaching troops near the front. Behind every rifleman stood thousands of workers, drivers, mechanics, cooks, engineers, and planners whose efforts rarely appeared in wartime photographs. Food was a critical part of that network. American military planners understood that morale depended not only on ammunition and equipment but also on familiar comforts. Soldiers received a variety of rations designed to provide calories, nutrition, and convenience. Among the most valued items was coffee. Coffee had become deeply embedded in American military culture long before World War II. Soldiers drank it at dawn before patrols. They drank it during cold nights in foxholes. They drank it while repairing vehicles, standing guard, or waiting for orders. Large field kitchens brewed it continuously. Mess tents served it with nearly every meal. For many Americans, coffee was not merely a beverage. It was part of daily life. The military recognized its importance. Millions of pounds of coffee were purchased and shipped overseas during the war. Quartermasters ensured that supplies reached troops whenever possible, even during major operations. Efforts were often made to provide hot coffee to exhausted units returning from combat. Red Cross workers became famous for serving fresh coffee and donuts at rest stations, transportation hubs, and military facilities throughout Europe. To American soldiers, these scenes felt normal. To many Germans, they appeared extraordinary. Years of blockade, rationing, bombing, and resource shortages had transformed everyday life inside Germany. Goods that Americans treated as routine had become rare luxuries. Coffee, chocolate, cigarettes, canned foods, and other common products often seemed plentiful wherever American forces appeared. German civilians noticed it. German soldiers noticed it. And captured prisoners noticed it as well. The contrast extended beyond food itself. Every steaming cup represented trucks that delivered fuel, ships that crossed oceans, warehouses filled with supplies, factories operating day and night. A vast economic machine functioning with remarkable efficiency despite the demands of a global conflict. Many German soldiers had spent years hearing that determination, courage, and sacrifice would decide the war. Yet, as they entered captivity, they found themselves confronted by another reality. Modern warfare was also a contest of production, transportation, and logistics. Soon, some of those prisoners would receive their first taste of American coffee. What seemed like a small gesture would become a surprisingly memorable lesson in the larger forces that had shaped the outcome of the war. For many German prisoners arriving in Allied custody during the final months of the war, capture felt like stepping into an unfamiliar world. Most had spent years inside a tightly controlled information environment. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, military briefings, and propaganda films presented carefully crafted images of Germany's enemies. Americans were often portrayed in contradictory ways, sometimes as wealthy but soft, sometimes as technologically capable but lacking discipline, sometimes as soldiers who relied more on equipment than determination. But reality on the battlefield had already begun challenging those assumptions. German troops had encountered American artillery capable of overwhelming entire defensive positions. They had watched endless streams of trucks move along Allied roads. They had faced aircraft that dominated the skies. Yet many still carried old stereotypes with them into captivity. Then they arrived at American camps. Instead of chaos, they often found organized processing centers. Records were taken, medical examinations were conducted, food was distributed, guards followed routines, vehicles arrived and departed according to schedules. The system appeared methodical. What stood out most, however, were often the smallest details. American soldiers seemed remarkably well supplied. Their uniforms appeared newer, their equipment looked plentiful, and almost everywhere there was coffee. German prisoners sometimes watched American personnel carrying steaming mugs throughout the day. Some found it amusing, others found it puzzling. Why did these men drink so much of it? Why was it available in such quantities when so many parts of Europe were suffering shortages? At first, the answer seemed cultural. Later, many would realize it was also economic. Because behind every cup stood a supply network that Germany could no longer match. Coffee occupied a unique place within the American military experience. Unlike rifles, tanks, or artillery shells, it could not destroy enemy positions. Yet military leaders understood that morale mattered almost as much as firepower. An exhausted soldier who remained alert, focused, and emotionally resilient was a more effective soldier. Coffee helped serve that purpose. Throughout the war, American troops came to associate its aroma with moments of relief amid uncertainty. A hot cup before dawn could provide comfort before an attack. A mug shared beside a vehicle convoy could offer a brief sense of normality. During freezing nights, coffee delivered warmth when little else could. Veterans frequently remembered it. Long after the war ended, field kitchens often brewed coffee continuously. Large containers accompanied troop movements. Cooks prepared it in quantities that seemed astonishing to observers from countries struggling with rationing and shortages. Its value extended beyond caffeine. Coffee represented routine. War constantly disrupted ordinary life. Soldiers slept in unfamiliar places, faced unpredictable dangers, and endured long periods away from home. Small rituals helped create stability. Drinking coffee became one of those rituals. For American troops, it was simply part of the day. For German prisoners observing from the outside, it became a visible symbol of something larger. It suggested confidence. It suggested abundance. Most importantly, it suggested that even in the midst of the largest war in history, the United States could still provide comforts that many Germans had not seen for years. Yet coffee revealed more than morale. It pointed toward the immense industrial system that made such abundance possible, a system whose scale would become increasingly impossible for prisoners to ignore. When historians discuss the outcome of World War II, they often focus on famous battles, military leaders, or strategic decisions, but many veterans remembered something simpler. Supplies. The United States possessed an industrial capacity unlike anything the world had previously witnessed. American factories produced aircraft by the tens of thousands. Shipyards launched cargo vessels at extraordinary rates. Automobile plants converted to wartime production and turned out trucks, tanks, engines, and equipment on an immense scale. Those achievements shaped daily life at the front. A soldier drinking coffee in Germany was connected to farmers harvesting crops thousands of miles away. He was connected to railroad workers transporting goods across North America. He was connected to merchant sailors crossing submarine-infested oceans and logistics personnel managing vast networks of WWII houses and depots. The journey of a single sack of coffee beans involved an international chain stretching across continents. German soldiers often saw only the final result, a steaming cup. Yet that cup represented ships that arrived on schedule, railroads that remained operational, fuel that remained available, warehouses that remained stocked, trucks that continued moving regardless of weather or distance. By 1945, Germany struggled to sustain many of these functions. The United States was performing them on a global scale. For prisoners who had experienced years of shortages, the contrast could be startling. What initially appeared to be a strange American habit was gradually revealing itself as evidence of a deeper reality, one that would become even clearer when curiosity finally overcame skepticism and the prisoners accepted a cup for themselves. The final months of the war created countless moments that would have seemed impossible only a few years earlier. Men who had once fought each other across rivers, forests, and ruined cities now stood within the same camps. One side carried weapons, the other carried prisoner identification tags. Yet, both sides were human beings navigating the uncertain end of a devastating conflict. For many German prisoners, captivity brought their first prolonged contact with ordinary Americans. Before surrender, most interactions had occurred through the violence of combat. A machine gun firing from a hedgerow, or artillery exploding across a hillside, revealed little about people on the opposite side. Inside processing centers and POW compounds, however, a different kind of encounter began. Prisoners watched American guards joke with one another, write letters home, repair vehicles, or wait in line for meals. They noticed familiar behaviors, complaints about weather, discussions about family, conversations about when the war might finally end. Coffee often appeared in these scenes. A guard holding a steaming mug during a cold morning shift looked less like an enemy from wartime propaganda and more like an ordinary soldier trying to stay warm and awake. Small observations accumulated over time. Curiosity replaced some of the fear and suspicion that had accompanied surrender. This did not erase the realities of war. Many prisoners remained bitter. Many guards remained cautious. The conflict's wounds were still fresh, yet ordinary moments possessed unexpected power. A shared observation, a brief exchange, a cup passed across a counter. These encounters reveal that beneath uniforms and national identities stood individuals whose daily concerns often looked remarkably similar. Throughout World War II, every major nation used propaganda to shape perceptions of the enemy. Germany was no exception. Years of official messaging encouraged soldiers and civilians to view opponents through simplified images. Such portrayals served military and political goals, but they rarely survived prolonged contact with reality. Captivity became one of the places where those narratives faced their greatest tests. Many German prisoners expected harsh treatment. Others expected disorder. Some believed Americans lacked discipline and relied solely on material advantages. The reality they encounter was often more complicated. American forces certainly possess enormous resources, but prisoners also observed organization, training, and professionalism. Processing systems handled vast numbers of captives. Medical personnel treated wounded prisoners alongside Allied casualties. Administrative procedures operated with surprising efficiency considering the chaos surrounding the collapse of Germany. Even seemingly trivial details challenged assumptions. The steady availability of coffee, food, cigarettes, and other supplies demonstrated that American abundance was not simply propaganda, it was visible every day. Trucks arrived when expected. Kitchens remained stocked, warehouses continued functioning. For German soldiers who had spent months coping with shortages, these observations carried significance far beyond comfort. They suggested that Allied strength rested upon more than battlefield success. It rested upon economic systems capable of sustaining armies across entire continents. Gradually, some prisoners began reassessing what they thought they knew about the enemy, not because of speeches, not because of official briefings, but because reality was unfolding directly in front of them. Nowhere was that reality more tangible than in the simple act of receiving a hot drink that Germany itself could scarcely provide. By the war's final months, history often remembers grand events, the Normandy landings, the Battle of the Bulge, the crossing of the Rhine, the fall of Berlin. Yet individuals frequently remember wars through much smaller details, a photograph carried in a pocket, a letter arriving from home, the smell of fresh bread after weeks of field rations. Or the taste of coffee after years of scarcity. For many former prisoners, these moments became symbols of larger truths. Coffee itself did not defeat Germany. No battle was won because a prisoner accepted a steaming mug from an American field kitchen, yet the drink represented forces that had shaped the entire conflict: industrial production, global transportation, agricultural output, economic endurance, the ability to maintain morale, all sustaining millions of soldiers across vast distances. In military history, logistics is often described as the foundation upon which operations are built. Generals may plan campaigns, hand soldiers may fight battles, but supplies determine how long those efforts can continue. A cup of coffee condensed that reality into something immediate and understandable. German prisoners could see it, smell it, taste it. What had begun as amusement gradually became recognition. The Americans were not drinking coffee because they were careless or indulgent. They were drinking it because their nation possessed the capacity to bring coffee across oceans, through ports, onto trains, into trucks, and finally into camps scattered across a continent still at war. Soon, one seemingly ordinary distribution of food and drink would transform these observations into a memorable moment, one that many prisoners would recall long after the shooting stopped. By April and early May 1945, the Western Front was collapsing. With remarkable speed, American armies had crossed the Rhine. Major German cities were falling one after another. Entire formations surrendered without firing a shot. Roads throughout western Germany filled with columns of prisoners moving toward temporary collection points, transit camps, and processing centers established to handle the enormous number of captives. Many of these facilities operated under immense pressure. Thousands of prisoners could arrive within a single day. Clerks recorded names and units. Medical personnel examined the wounded. Guards directed groups toward designated areas. Field kitchens worked continuously to provide basic meals. The war might have been ending, but the logistical challenge remained enormous. For exhausted German soldiers, arrival often brought a mixture of emotions: relief, uncertainty, humiliation, and curiosity. The fighting was over for them. Yet they had entered an unfamiliar system whose routines they did not fully understand. As they waited in lines or gathered in holding areas, they observed the activity around them. American trucks arrived carrying supplies. Cooks moved between steaming kettles. Soldiers carried metal cups filled with dark liquid. Coffee seemed to be everywhere. Some prisoners joked about it. Others shook their heads in amusement. After years of shortages, the sight appeared almost absurd. Germany had spent the final stages of the war struggling to provide basic necessities. Yet here were American soldiers casually drinking what many Europeans now considered a luxury. The aroma drifted across the camp. Rich, warm, unmistakable. For many prisoners, the smell itself felt unfamiliar. Real coffee had become increasingly rare. In Germany, as the war progressed, most soldiers had long since grown accustomed to substitutes made from roasted grains, chicory, or other ingredients intended to imitate the original beverage. Then came the moment that transformed observation into experience. Field kitchens began distributing drinks alongside food. Some prisoners accepted cups immediately, others hesitated, a few remained skeptical. The dark liquid looked stronger than the ersatz coffee they remembered from home. Some wondered whether it would be bitter. Others questioned why Americans seemed so devoted to it in the first place. There was still laughter in parts of the line. Comments were exchanged. Smiles appeared. To some prisoners, it remained merely another strange American habit. Yet curiosity has a way of overcoming skepticism. One by one, cups were lifted. Steam rose into the cool spring air. The men who had spent months retreating across battlefields, enduring shortages, and listening to distant artillery now found themselves standing quietly with a drink in their hands. The first sip was only seconds away, and with it would come a realization that extended far beyond the taste itself. The first reaction was often surprise, not because the drink was exotic or unfamiliar. Coffee had been known in Germany for generations. Before the war, it had been a normal part of daily life for millions of people. The surprise came from the difference. For years, many German soldiers had consumed substitutes. Wartime shortages had forced civilians and troops alike to rely on ersatz coffee made from roasted barley, chicory, acorns, sugar beets, and other ingredients. These beverages provided warmth and routine, but they lacked the richness and strength of genuine coffee beans. Now, standing in a prisoner camp at the very moment Germany was collapsing, many encountered the real thing again. The flavor was stronger, the aroma lingered longer. The bitterness was sharper, yet somehow more satisfying. The laughter that had accompanied the first cups gradually faded. Men who had expected little from the drink took another sip, then another. Round them, the camp continued operating. Trucks moved along muddy roads. Guards directed prisoners toward registration points. Cooks ladled food into waiting containers. The machinery of captivity continued without pause. Yet for some prisoners, a quiet realization was taking shape. This coffee had not appeared by accident. It had crossed oceans. It had survived transportation through ports, warehouses, rail lines, and truck convoys. It had arrived in a temporary camp thousands of miles from the farms and markets where it originated. And it was being served not as a rare luxury, but as something routine. That fact carried weight. Many German soldiers had spent the war witnessing increasing scarcity. Fuel became precious. Ammunition was rationed. Vehicles disappeared from roads. Food portions shrank. Entire units adapted to shortages that seemed unimaginable during the early years of the conflict. The Americans appeared to inhabit a different reality, even after fighting across North Africa, Italy, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Germany itself. They continued distributing supplies on a scale that astonished observers. The cup in a prisoner's hand became evidence of that reality. It represented ships crossing the Atlantic in enormous numbers. It represented factories producing equipment faster than losses could consume. It represented farms capable of feeding armies while still supplying civilians at home. Most of all, it represented endurance. Modern war demanded more than courage. It demanded fuel for vehicles, food for soldiers, spare parts for machinery, and transportation networks capable of moving everything where it was needed. The side that mastered these requirements possessed a powerful advantage long before a battle began. Some prisoners understood this immediately, others arrived at the conclusion more gradually. But the lesson became difficult to ignore. Germany had entered the war believing that battlefield victories would secure its future. Yet by 1945, the conflict had become a contest of resources, production, and logistics on a global scale. Against the combined industrial power of the Allies, especially the United States, that contest proved impossible to sustain indefinitely. Years later, many veterans would remember tanks, aircraft, and artillery, yet some also remembered smaller details: the endless truck convoys, the stocked warehouses, the abundance of food, and, surprisingly often, the coffee. Because in that ordinary drink they saw a glimpse of the larger forces that had shaped the outcome of the war. The shooting was ending. Germany would surrender unconditionally on May 1945. But for millions of prisoners now entering captivity, the process of understanding how that defeat had occurred was only beginning. And that understanding would continue long after the last cup had been emptied. When Germany surrendered in May 1945, the fighting in Europe ended almost overnight. The explosions that had echoed across the continent for years gradually faded. Front lines disappeared. Military maps that once tracked advancing armies became records of a war that was finally over. For millions of German soldiers, however, a new chapter had begun. They were now prisoners across Europe. Enormous camps housed captured troops awaiting processing, transfer, release, or longer periods of detention. The scale was unprecedented. Allied authorities suddenly found themselves responsible for feeding, housing, and administering vast numbers of former enemy soldiers, conditions varied depending on location, resources, and the immediate post-war situation. Some camps struggled with overcrowding, especially during the chaotic weeks following Germany's collapse. Yet despite the challenges, prisoners encountered something many had not experienced for a long time: stability. Meals arrived according to schedules, medical examinations became routine. Administrative systems replaced battlefield uncertainty. The contrast with the final months of the war was striking. Many prisoners had spent weeks retreating through devastated landscapes where supply lines barely functioned. Some had survived on reduced rations. Others had watched entire units dissolve as communications and transportation networks failed. Now, even inside captivity, there was a predictable structure to daily life. American logistics remained visible. Everywhere. Trucks delivered food. Warehouses distributed equipment. Field kitchens prepared meals for thousands. Coffee continued to appear as part of that system for American personnel. This remained entirely ordinary. Coffee accompanied breakfast, work details, guard shifts, and administrative duties just as it had throughout the war. Prisoners observed the habit repeatedly, often with less amusement than before. The novelty had worn off. What remained was recognition. The drink represented a larger reality they encountered every day. Supplies arrived when expected. Food stocks remained available. Vehicles remained operational. The vast machinery had supported Allied victory continued functioning even after combat operations ceased. Many prisoners spent long hours discussing the war and its outcome. Conversations frequently turned toward the same question: how had Germany lost despite years of battlefield successes? The answers varied. Some blamed strategic mistakes, others pointed to military decisions, political leadership, or the opening of multiple fronts. Yet increasingly, many acknowledged another factor. The Allies had possessed resources on a scale Germany could never equal. Every convoy, warehouse, and field kitchen seemed to reinforce that conclusion, and nowhere was it more visible than in the ordinary routines of daily camp life. Where abundance had become so common, had Americans barely noticed it at all. The longer prisoners remained in captivity, the more those observations shaped their understanding of the war had just ended. As months passed and prisoners gradually returned home, many carried more than personal memories of battles and surrender. They carried new perspectives. The Germany to which they returned was profoundly changed. Cities lay in ruins. Railway stations stood damaged or destroyed. Factories had been bombed. Housing shortages affected millions. Families searched for missing relatives. Daily life revolved around reconstruction and survival. Against this backdrop, memories from captivity often took on new meaning. Former prisoners remembered the enormous truck convoys they had seen moving through Allied-controlled territory. They remembered warehouses stocked with supplies. They remembered rail networks operating with efficiency despite the scale of military operations. And they remembered countless examples of material abundance that had seemed almost unbelievable. During the war's final months, coffee became one of those memories, not because it was the most important thing they encountered, but because it symbolized something larger. A cup of coffee was easy to understand. Anyone could hold it, anyone could taste it. Yet behind that simple object stood an economic system capable of sustaining millions of soldiers across multiple continents simultaneously. What had appeared to be a small comfort was actually evidence of immense organizational and industrial strength. Many post-war memoirs and recollections from soldiers of various nations reflect a similar realization. Again and again, veterans described their astonishment at Allied logistical capabilities. Some remembered endless supplies of fuel. Others recalled the quantity of vehicles, food, or equipment available to American forces. The details differed, but the underlying observation remained remarkably consistent. The Allies possessed resources that Germany could not match. This realization did not erase the hardships experienced by prisoners, nor did it simplify the complex causes of the war's outcome. Military history is rarely explained by a single factor. Leadership, strategy, geography, technology, intelligence, and countless other variables played crucial roles, yet logistics connected all of them. Without supplies, strategy could not be executed. Without transportation, equipment could not reach the battlefield. Without food, soldiers could not continue fighting. The war had demonstrated these truths on a global scale. By the late 1940s and early 1950s, Western Europe was entering a new era of recovery. Economic reconstruction gradually restored industries and infrastructure. Trade resumed. Consumer goods returned to store shelves. Coffee, once again, became a familiar part of everyday life for many Europeans, but for some former German soldiers, the memory remained attached to a specific moment: a muddy camp, a steaming field kitchen, a line of exhausted prisoners, and a first sip that transformed a source of amusement into a lesson about the forces that had shaped the 20th century. Long after armies had disbanded and battlefields had fallen silent, that ordinary cup continued to symbolize an extraordinary reality. Wars are fought by soldiers, but they are sustained and often decided by the system standing behind them. The significance of that lesson extends far beyond World War II itself. History often remembers wars through dramatic images: columns of tanks advancing across open ground, aircraft filling the sky, generals studying maps beneath dim lights, flags raised over captured cities. Yet the experiences that remain with ordinary people are frequently much smaller: a meal share after months of hardship, a letter arriving from home, the smell of rain on a quiet morning after the guns have fallen, silent, or a cup of coffee handed to a tired prisoner standing at the end of a lost war. The story of German prisoners encountering American coffee is not really about a beverage. It is about what that beverage represented. Behind every steaming cup stood farmers, factory workers, sailors, railroad crews, truck drivers, cooks, and logisticians. Their labor formed a vast network capable of moving resources across oceans and continents. It was a form of power rarely celebrated in wartime headlines, yet it proved as important as any tank, aircraft, or artillery piece. For the prisoners who laughed before taking their first sip, the lesson arrived in an unexpected way. What seemed like a curious American habit became evidence of something much larger. A glimpse into the economic strength and organizational capacity had helped shape the outcome of World War II. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. The battles became history. The armies dispersed, the ruins were rebuilt, but sometimes the greatest truths about a conflict survive, not in grand monuments or famous speeches, but in ordinary moments that reveal how the world truly worked. And for some German prisoners, that truth arrived in the warmth of a simple metal cup held between their hands on a cold spring day in 194. 5.